He wrote over 300 books, created revolutionary approaches to education and agriculture, and founded spiritual science with adherents to this day. But was he a good person? This is episode 1 of The Modern Magician. Today we're talking about Rudolf Steiner. Most people don't know about Rudolf Steiner. He was an Austrian mystic, self-proclaimed clairvoyant who lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He's perhaps best known as the founder of Anthroposophy, which is often referred to as spirit science or spiritual science. He was born in Austria, in what is now Croatia, went to school in Vienna, moved to Germany in 1888, at which point he began to study under Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. In 1899, Steiner was invited to give a speech to the Theosophical Society. He joined the Theosophical Society as the head of its German wing without ever formally being a member, got into a disagreement with the leadership of the organization, and ended up breaking off from Theosophy. And he basically took the entire German wing of Theosophy with him. He was that popular. Steiner moved from Germany to Dornach, Switzerland, where he built, with volunteer labor, a phenomenal community center called the Gärtnernamt, after his teacher, Goethe. The original Gärtnernamt was actually burned down by an unknown arsonist. Some people think it might have been a Nazi sympathizer. We'll get into that in a second. But it was rebuilt, construction being completed just a couple years before he passed away in 1925. Now, before Steiner died, he did a lot. He produced major works and initiatives in the fields of education. He founded Waldorf schools, which there are still hundreds of Waldorf schools to this day. He also founded Biodynamic Agriculture, which is one of the first sustainable farming movements that saw the farm as a cohesive organism. He invented a new performing art called Eurythmy. He actually did the architecture and design on both Gärtnernamts himself. They're beautiful structures. I'm going to put a picture up right here just so you guys can see, but they don't look like any other building I've seen. He was also a proponent of a pretty substantial social, political, economic philosophy he called the threefold social organism. In addition to all this other stuff, he delivered lectures, he wrote books, he was incredibly prolific. So prolific that you basically can't read everything he wrote. Most people who know anything about Steiner have read 4 or 5 books at the most, and I myself have only read 3.5. He did a lot, and it was all governed by his spiritual philosophy, Anthroposophy, in which he saw the human being as the most important part of creation. So as I said before, what Steiner was most well known for was founding Anthroposophy. Anthroposophy's whole shtick was that the world of the spirit could be understood and experienced objectively within the human being through the rigorous application of scientific thinking. It's a pretty radical idea, and one that a lot of conventional thinkers struggle with. Nonetheless, the artist in me finds this incredibly appealing because it's nice to see somebody that believes in sort of the woo-woo spirituality stuff that I feel like is important to human life, but also isn't satisfied with just throwing up his hands and saying it's magic. He wants to try and explain it. So I respect that. He's attempting to understand a universal quality of human experience that is not generally easily understood or explained. I guess the best way to explain it, and these are my words, not his, is that our intellectual capacities as human beings, our self-awareness and our ability to create art and to reason, are not only evidence of our spiritual development above other creatures, but are also the capacities we have with which we can know higher worlds. Basically, that the creative process, the act of making art, is a direct communion with the spirit realm, a place we do not traditionally think of as existing, much less having a tangible effect on the material world. I think it's a pretty cool idea, and it lines up with some of the stuff that I've picked up from reading various ancient Chinese texts, the idea that heaven isn't a place so much as a realm that runs parallel to Earth, the forms of heaven exist in perfection in our minds, and you can always imagine the perfect chair, but you can never create the perfect chair. And the thing about both what Steiner's saying and the other ideas I've read about this is that when something comes out of heaven, it inevitably loses information in the process, and that's why you can never have the Platonic ideal chair in reality. It can only exist in your mind. So that mind's eye image of the chair, and it could be wrong, but I think that Steiner's trying to say that that is spiritual perception. Grasping with ideas, being inspired to create something, putting notions together in your head. These are messages from the spiritual realm. And the better you get at recognizing that and seeing these things as they happen in your mind, the more cultivated your spiritual sight becomes, the more you can see. As an artist, this lights me up like a Christmas tree. Anybody can walk around and talk about magic and auras and your reincarnated grandma, but Steiner's the first guy I've read who tries really hard to center the conversation around rational, practical application of these otherwise very fuzzy ideas. To him, it wasn't a matter of waiting around to be picked or chosen by the gods or have a vision revealed to you. It was a matter of actively cultivating your own spiritual perception so that you could perceive these things that were all around you all the time. These ideas have a lot to do with your perspective of reality. And one of the big things I've realized is that these ideas are only irrational so far as you choose to believe in them without trying to understand them. When you really start grappling with the miracle of your consciousness, you start to be able to see how music and art and language and psychiatry and all of these different human pursuits can be contextualized as somewhat magical, as spiritual pursuits. These things fundamentally alter the state of something, consciousness, we do not understand. And so it's very easy to frame that as magic. And I would argue, fun. All that being said, Steiner loses me on some stuff. He does a lot of, you'll understand when you cultivate your spiritual sight more. And he uses very confusing language while insisting that if you don't get it, it's because you haven't thought hard enough about it. It kind of plays into his hypothesis about how our intellectual capacities are our bridge to the spirit realm. But I'm also a proponent of the idea that truth holds up under scrutiny, and the more impossibly complicated your explanations are, the further and further away you might be getting from truth. If you can't sum it up for a fourth grader, you might be high on your own BS. One thing that Steiner and a lot of other spiritual teachers never seem to fess up to is that they could be wrong. I very rarely see teachers admit that their own minds have the capacity to fool them, and that their entire worldview could be operating from a faulty premise. The human brain can catch a glimpse of something and build an entire framework over what that thing was and what it means, only to see on closer inspection that it was completely wrong about what the thing was in the first place. I don't know how many times I've driven past a road sign and thought that it said some ridiculous swear word. I think this awareness is critical to observing and learning from these old esotericists without losing yourself to a false reality. Remembering that your brain has the ability to trick you into thinking things that are real aren't real, and that things that aren't real are. The entire sensation of beauty is a carryover from evolutionary forces that trained us to realize that if we didn't recognize patterns and meanings quickly, we could die. Now more than ever, that pattern recognition can be a liability. I think you can credit that to why flat earth theory is back. You can credit that to anti-vaxxers. All that comes from people seeing patterns and finding meaning in them without necessarily becoming self-skeptical and realizing that they could be wrong. Steiner is guilty of this. A lot of the science that informs me here came out after he died. And so I wonder that if he could see the world we have today, maybe he would modify some of his notions. Who's to say? So I mentioned that Steiner broke off from Theosophy and founded Anthroposophy. He was the head of Theosophy's German wing, and so when he split, he basically took every German Theosophist and converted them to Anthroposophists. And this leads me to my next point. Was Rudolf Steiner a good person? So while I was learning about Steiner, I got very frustrated with the density of some of his ideas, and on a whim, I decided to Google Rudolf Steiner crazy. And immediately I turned up some very alarming things. There's a good degree of controversy around anthroposophy. There are I Survived Waldorf Schools support groups online. There's anecdotes about anthroposophical medicine being used to be cruel to children. And there's a particularly damning article by Peter Staudenmaier written about how Rudolf Steiner and the anthroposophists were buddy-buddy with the Nazis during Hitler's rise to power. Ugh. And I don't think this video would be complete unless we talked about some of this. So, Waldorf schools brainwashing. Apparently in 1979, the New York Times ran an article about how a student at a Waldorf school decided they were psychic, and the faculty of the school gave control of the school to the psychic kid. What? So the thing about Waldorf education is that it's founded on Steiner's principles of cultivating the entire human being as a spiritual entity. He had ideas about karma. All these sorts of things have influenced what Waldorf education became. Separated from this, Waldorf education is just sort of a holistic approach to education. It's a lot like Montessori schooling and has been compared as such. But you can't really divorce the system from the spiritual ideals of its founder. So there's a degree of Waldorf educators out there who are undoubtedly anthroposophists and believe wholeheartedly in everything Steiner had to say. So inevitably, you're going to get some wackos. You're going to get some people that come along and think, oh, this child announced they're psychic. I should make them the leader. One of the things I kind of want to point out that I didn't mention yet is that part of the reason Steiner broke off from Theosophy in the first place was that the leaders of the Theosophical Society wanted to say that the new Messiah was incarnating in this 14-year-old boy named Krishnamurti, who later renounced the title. Conceivably, there were other rifts between Steiner and the rest of the Theosophists, but that to him was ridiculous. So to have this Waldorf school in the 1970s say that, oh, this kid's psychic, here's the power, you can do it. A little absurd. There have been other stories of anthroposophists abusing their kids, taking them in for a medical evaluation and finding out about a food allergy and just feeding them that food over and over and over again so that they can work out their karma. Now, I don't want to sit here and say that anthroposophy is to blame for that, because people who aren't going to think clearly are going to do that under the guise of anything. People do it. There's Christians that do it. There's Muslims who do it. There's people of every faith and every ideology and every background who will do something crappy to somebody and then try to justify it by saying, well, he said, some guy that's been dead for, hundreds of years. Now, one thing I do want to get into is this article by Peter Staudenmaier in which he talks about how Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy is not just compatible with racist ideologies, but perhaps gives rise to racist ideologies. One of the most damning quotes from one of Steiner's lectures to the Theosophical Society shows that he had this notion of root races, which sounds problematic until you put it in the context of this older theosophical idea that long ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, there were these root races that were evolving and taking over from each other in Atlantis, that sort of a thing. If you've ever heard the phrase Lemurian or Hyperborean, the final of the root races is the Aryans. We all know who the Aryans are now, thanks to a little boy named Adolf Hitler. But the only reason Aryans were on Hitler's radar was because of these mystical theosophical notions of these root races. Now, the Aryans are actually anthropologically a historical group of people. They were Indo-Iranians that descended, and they were conquerors in India, and there's lots of history behind them. There wasn't anything particularly special about them. They were just people. So when you say Aryan, and you take it to mean Hitler's concept of Aryan as a blonde, blue-eyed white person, that's a corruption of the concept. Mind you, he also took the swastika, a symbol of peace and universal balance, and turned it into a symbol of hating Jews. So, I think that the most damning ideas that Staudenmaier mentions in his article about Steiner, or that Steiner had, or that he at one point communicated, is probably this notion he had of race-to-race reincarnation. Steiner has this notion that when a person dies, if they were good and worked off enough of their karma, they can reincarnate as an ascending race as opposed to a descending race. I'm not entirely sure if he means white people and black people or Chinese people. That, to me, it's still kind of obscure. After reading about the definition of Aryan having been co-opted by the Nazis and changed into our idea of white people with blonde hair, Aryans were Indo-Iranians. They weren't white originally. Now, Steiner has plenty of redeeming quotes about the concept of race. One of his most outspoken ideas about race is that it's not useful. The idea of race, this construct we have, this separation between human beings, is in fact an artificial separation, and that the core of the human being, their spiritual energy, their spiritual aspect, has nothing to do with their physical body. I don't know if Staudenmaier is conflating the ideas wrong or not. I don't know if I can trust his writing to be factual about Steiner's racism when on other occasions I've seen Steiner say that race as we talk about it is a complete fabrication and is not useful to anybody's spiritual development. So it seems weird to me that he would both believe in this racial goodness reincarnation and also not believe that race was a useful concept to discuss. So I'm not really sure what to make of it, aside from it's something to pay attention to. It's something to know about if you're going to read this dude and if you're going to look into the history of the Anthroposophical Society. And, you know, at the end of the day, there's too much Steiner to read for me to know what he said his entire life. It would surprise me if he never said anything troubling or problematic, because who hasn't? Staudenmaier's other big accusation against Steiner and anthroposophists in general is that anthroposophists had a pretty cozy relationship with the rising Nazi party. Now, Steiner himself actually left Germany in 1914 when he moved to Dornach, but anthroposophy was a German movement born from the ashes of the German wing of theosophy. So there were a lot of German anthroposophists. Apparently there were even a couple of high-ranking Nazi officials who subscribed to the ideology of anthroposophy. There was a biodynamic garden grown at Dachau, the work camp, and generally there were not a lot of anthroposophists who were picked off and attacked by the Nazi party up until the very end. This has been described as infighting between those high-ranking Nazi officials and others, because when you're a Nazi, you hate everybody, except yourself. It would be absurd to say that, oh, I'm sure anthroposophists had a good reason. Well, of course they didn't, because nobody did. Something I tried to keep in mind reading that was that during the rise of a tyrannical, fear-based regime, lots of people try to be buddies with the tyrant as a survival tactic. It's not really good or honorable, but people do it, and it's not necessarily because of their ideology. Just like with the quackery of anthroposophical medicine and Waldorf school teachers allowing a psychic to take over the school, I think this is another one of those questions of individuals that subscribe to a movement do not represent the movement, nor do they represent the ideas, but rather their individual interpretation of them. And so you're going to have people like that in every world and every society. Christianity is not fundamentally wicked or cruel, but there are wicked and cruel Christians, just like there are wonderful Christians who would give the clothes off their back to somebody in need. So I think it's important to create that emotional distance between the ideas of anthroposophy and what anthroposophists may have done over the years. Hitler and the Nazis co-opted a lot of ideas that were not originally hateful or cruel or violent. The idea of the Aryans, the swastika symbol, all of these are other people's ideas that he came along and co-opted and transformed the meanings of. It's weaponized mimetics, like the way people changed Pepe the Frog into a hate symbol. It's up to us as the people watching these things unfold to have the critical thinking necessary to see through it and maybe get some meaningful insights out of it. There's one other criticism of Steiner that I wanted to get to because it's from another spiritual teacher that I don't know a lot about, but I know that some of you might, because he's the guy that started the colony that Wild Country, Netflix's documentary, is about. Osho is his name. And while I was searching for critical information about Steiner and anthroposophy, I stumbled upon a correspondence between Osho and somebody who subscribed to Steiner's ideas. This person wrote to Osho and told him that he was being torn between Osho's ideas and Steiner's ideas. Osho's response was basically that Steiner was a brilliant man, very talented, but all he did was think. In Osho's mind, the true religion is no thinking. That sort of complete open meditation, trying to silence your inner mind to the point that it's gone, having no focus. Not focusing on Christ or on the human being or on the spirit realm, not cultivating these spiritual faculties through the intellectual pursuit, but rather learning to let go of it entirely and become silence. Now, I will tell you that I think that's sensible. I think that appeals to me a lot as well. I think that the idea of tapping into that silence is important to the development of a healthy human being, because in doing that, you begin to understand more about the fact that you actually aren't a person. You're this illusion that you're constantly experiencing yourself. But when you stop and breathe and get your mind to shut up for a minute, you realize that you're not you. You're not your I. You're not your ego. Now, the irony of that is that Osho was criticizing Rudolf Steiner's use of ego, but Osho started a movement based around him. That's the thing. Me sitting here telling you guys about this is ego. To say this isn't ego is to deny a fundamental truth about people. You can't separate yourself from your ego and also do stuff. You can't separate yourself from your ego and start a foundation and go out and live your life, because every action you take, any action you take, that's coming from a place of ego. It's self-preservation. It's attempting to create some value for yourself. I think that anybody who goes around and tells themselves that they gave that money to that homeless person for them, it's true to a degree, but also you're doing it because it makes you feel good. You're doing it because doing it brings value into your life. And to deny that is to deny how it works. But what it boils down to is, as I was reading Osho's thing, I kind of raised my eyebrow and laughed a little bit and thought, well, at the end of the day, we're all egos. We're all egos, and every spiritual teacher is an ego. And anybody that tries to tell you how to attain higher worlds or how to quiet your inner voice is an ego. And I think that the greatest spiritual teachers in human history, Jesus Christ and Buddha, all these people, the thing that ties all of their lessons together is that they were trying to tell us that they aren't special. You and I are just like them. And it's a matter of learning to step into that and be aware of that and realize that you too can live like that. And over time, their exploits become mythologized, and you find out about how they're immortal and they rise from the dead and they do all this magic stuff. But the big thing that they all said was that they weren't special. They were just like us, that the kingdom of God is inside of us, that all of us have the Buddha nature in us. We are able to be that. So, okay, all told, I think Rudolf Steiner was a pretty okay guy. As far as spiritual religious ideas go, I think Anthroposophy is pretty cool. I wouldn't go join their ranks, but I like the underlying ideas beneath what they're saying. I resonate with a lot of what they have to say. A lot of those ideas about the spiritual realm being accessed through the mind, I see those as very useful to a person trying to find meaning in this world. I think that a lot of the criticisms levied against Steiner's character are a bit of a stretch. I know that from his writing and from a lot of the ideas he's expressed, he seems like a person who genuinely believed in this ecumenical, universal human society, and that's something that I very much resonate with. I think that his most damning ideas, as presented in that Staudenmaier article, are peculiar contradictions from a lot of the other stuff he wrote, and that makes me skeptical. And it seems like he spent most of his time trying to present ideas that embodied the dignity of the spiritual human being and how that should be the goal of all of our work. The claim of anthroposophists being quack physicians and crazy brainwashing school teachers and buddy-buddy with the Nazis, I think all that's to be expected with humans in general. People will take advantage of ideas and use them as a get-out-of-jail-free card for their own unresolved BS. I think that to take that as something fundamentally flawed about anthroposophy as a whole is not much different from taking hardcore Christian fundamentalism or Islamic extremism as reflective of a religion as a whole. You can't look at the worst elements and say, see, they're bad, because that's reductive. So yeah, I like Steiner. I think he was a pretty intelligent person. He did a lot of cool stuff. He had a lot of cool ideas about the world, and he wasn't perfect. I value the work that he put out. It has definitely made me think a little differently about inspiration and creativity, and it has in fact inspired a lot of my ideas for some of my own artistic work. The sheer amount of literature that dude put out is frankly intimidating, and something that I think that it's worth aspiring to. And one thing I really didn't get into in this video, because I kind of want to make it its own thing, is his political philosophy and the threefold social organism, which I actually think is really cool. But I'm not going to talk too much about that right now. But you know, that's just like my opinion, man. I am as emotionally biased as anybody else. I'm full of hubris. So if you guys want to check out some of the stuff I read, I'm going to put some of the sources down below and let you guys tear me apart if you want. So what do you guys think? Was Steiner ignorant? If he was his ignorance excusable? Do the bad apples in the anthroposophical movement spoil the bunch? More interestingly, what do you guys think about Rudolf Steiner's spiritual ideas? The notion that the spiritual realm is observable and that we can cultivate an awareness of it through objective scientific approaches within our own mind. Was he crazy? Was he a genius? Leave a comment below and we'll get into a conversation. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time. How do you feel about Rudolf Steiner? Are you clean yet? You're a very good boy. Yes. Yes? Hey. Would you like to climb? Would you like to clamber? Would you like to clamber? Yes. Up, 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 up. Hello. Where you go? You flee? What do you do? Ah. Okay. You're very, yeah, okay.